Hello everyone and welcome to this research methods lesson on self-report techniques and designs. So during this video we're going to have a look at two different ways of self-reporting. We're going to have a little bit of a look at how you can design different self-report studies, a couple of do's and don'ts when it comes to self-reporting, and then we will also look at some strengths and weaknesses and finish off with a couple of exam questions. There are two types of self-report techniques that you're going to learn about in this video. You've got questionnaires and you've got interviews. And self-reporting essentially involves asking participants a question and then allowing them to respond and tell you about their experiences, their beliefs, their values, their feelings, their thoughts. Whatever it is that the topic is about, they are responding to you about that topic. Okay. Self-reporting is also a form of non-experimental method, just like observations are as well. They are non-experimental because any researcher can't infer cause and effect from the findings that they gain from self-reporting. Okay, so they can only ever talk about a relationship rather than actual one thing causing another. Okay, and one final thing as well before we get started properly, questionnaires and interviews are most often used within an experiment of some kind, and they're often used to measure the DV within an experiment. Okay, you can use them by themselves, but most of the time that's not the way that it works. Most of the time they're used as a means of measuring the DV. Okay, so let's have a look at questionnaires. Questionnaires involve a preset list of written questions to which participants respond. They're used most often to assess thoughts and feelings, and they can be as simple as a one-question questionnaire, but they can also be as complicated as a 50-question questionnaire as well. It doesn't matter really how many questions are on the questionnaire, you just need to have at least one. Okay, and like I said before, they can be used as part of an experiment to assess the DV within that experiment. Now, when you're using a questionnaire, you have different types of questions and different types and different styles of questions that you can use. Most broadly, though, they can be categorized into two different types. You've got open questions and closed questions. There's an example of both. Okay, so open questions don't have a fixed range of answers. Okay, if you get asked an open question, for example, how was the presentation, or how did you feel about that study, then the respondent or whoever it is that you're asking the question to is free to answer in any which way that they want. Open questions will very often produce what's known as qualitative data, which means it's descriptive data, and it produces data that is very, very rich in detail. However, the trade-off with that is that that qualitative data can often be a little bit tricky to analyze. Closed questions, on the other hand, involve having a fixed number of responses. Okay, you can produce both qualitative data and quantitative data when you use closed questions. Quantitative data is numerical data. So for example, on the screen right now, you've got an example of closed questions that would produce qualitative data because it's descriptive. But I could very easily turn that into quantitative data if I wanted to by counting up how often every response gets said. Alternatively, if I were to give somebody a rating scale, let's say, and say rate your enjoyment on a scale of 1 to 5, then that would also produce quantitative data because it's numerical. Quantitative data is very, very easy to analyze, unlike qualitative data, but it is a little bit more rigid, as in it doesn't give you the same rich detail that an open question would give you. Now, sticking with question styles for a little while, closed questions can be further divided into three different categories. Okay, so you've got what's known as a Likert scale. A Likert scale is a scale where respondents indicate their agreement or disagreement with a particular statement, and they do that using a scale of usually 5 points. Okay, so it's called a 5-point Likert scale. You've also got what's known as a rating scale. That's very, very similar to a Likert scale, but in this one, respondents get to identify a value that represents the strength of a feeling about a particular topic. And then you've also got what's known as a fixed choice option, which essentially involves you ticking whichever option most applies to you from a fixed number of options, just like you can see on the screen there. Okay, so you might be wondering why this type of stuff is important. I mean, you've obviously all seen things like that before. However, if you have a little look at this, you can see that if you were ever to get a question, for example, a 12-mark designer study question, if you were ever to get a question that asks you to carry out a self-report study, you might need to know, if it just asks you to talk about open and closed questions, it wouldn't be enough to just say, oh, I would use a closed question to gather quantitative data. You might actually need to go into a little bit more detail and say, well, in my self-report study, I would ask my participants their opinions on XYZ using a 5-point Likert scale. Okay, so it just gives you the option to go into a little bit more detail if you know what the options are for writing a closed question. So let's have a little bit of a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of questionnaires. So first off, we'll start with the strengths, and the first strength is that it is very, very cost effective. Okay, people can gather a large amount of data very, very quickly because questionnaires can be handed out to a lot of people without very much effort. Okay, sticking with the effort as well, you don't actually have to be there as a researcher to conduct the questionnaire. You can send it out in the post, you can put it on Facebook or Instagram or wherever else I suppose that you might want to put it, and people can fill it out and then get it back to you either electronically or in the post. So again, minimal effort on the researcher's part is required. And then finally, data is very, very straightforward to analyze when you are using a questionnaire, particularly if you're using closed questions, which means that you can do statistical analysis and you can draw comparisons between groups using graphs and charts and so on. Okay, so lots of good stuff going on there in terms of the analysis side of the results. However, that being said, there are also some weaknesses of questionnaires, and that is, number one, that it has a social desirability bias. Okay, a social desirability bias essentially means that people may not always tell the truth, because people want to make themselves look good when people are asking them questions, and they don't really want to admit to something that might make them look bad. So for example, if somebody asked you how much alcohol do you drink in a week, you might say that you drink less than you actually do because you don't want to look bad. Okay, so people lie in order to make themselves look better. You've also got what's known as a response bias as well. So a response bias means that people tend to reply in a similar way as they go through their questionnaire. So they might always tick, I don't know, the option 5, so 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 if you've got a Likert scale or a rating scale. And they might do that without actually reading the question, because either they get bored or they don't read the question properly, so they just assume that that end of the scale always applies to them. Obviously there's a problem there because then the responses may not actually be accurate and may not actually reflect the participants' opinions and the participants' thoughts and views and so on. Okay, so that's called a response bias. So moving on to the second part of this particular video, and we're going to have a little look at interviews. Okay, so interviews are face-to-face interactions between an interviewer and an interviewee. Okay, and you've got three different types of interviews that you need to be aware of. You've got structured interviews, unstructured interviews, and semi-structured interviews. Structured interviews are essentially like questionnaires that are conducted face-to-face. There are a set of predetermined questions, and the interviewer will ask those questions and will wait for a response from the person being interviewed. There's no deviation from the questions, it is just a straight question, answer, move on. Your unstructured interview is the exact opposite. So an unstructured interview is more like a conversation. It's very, very free-flowing. The interviewer will have a topic that he wants to discuss or that she wants to discuss, but he won't have a set of questions. Okay, and the interviewee is encouraged to expand and elaborate, and if the conversation takes you down one road, then you'll follow it to see where it goes. And then finally, you have your semi-structured interview, which is a kind of halfway house between the two. And a semi-structured interview involves a preset list of questions which the interviewer will kind of follow, but the interviewer is also allowed to follow up certain trails of thought if he wants a little bit more detail, and the interviewee is also allowed to elaborate and to go into a little bit more detail if he or she feels like they want to. Okay, so it's a little bit like a job interview. They have set questions, but they might ask you to elaborate if they want more detail. That's generally the most common and the most popular type of interview that you're going to get. Okay, so when you're designing interviews, there are a few do's and don'ts that you should be aware of. And this is particularly important if you ever get asked at an exam to describe the process of an interview or describe how you would conduct an interview if you were a researcher. Okay, so number one is that there should always be an interview schedule. Okay, an interview schedule is a list of questions that you intend to cover as an interviewer. It's also very important that you say that this interview schedule is standardized. Okay, standardized means that everybody experiences the same questions and therefore everybody experiences the same interview. Okay, that will reduce the impact of interviewer bias, and it will stop any interviewers kind of changing the questions intentionally or unintentionally, which could have an impact on the answers that they receive. You also are going to want to think about doing single and or group interviews. Okay, both are fine. If you're doing a group interview, then there'll be a group of you answering questions, and that's generally fine. If you're doing a single interview, then you're going to want to think about taking the one person that you're interviewing into a quiet room away from the others. It will put people at ease a little bit, and it will make them more comfortable, and it'll just kind of make them feel more able to talk about stuff, particularly if it's a sensitive issue. As an interviewer, you're going to want to establish some kind of rapport with your interviewee. It will make them feel a little bit more comfortable, and it will make them feel a little bit more at ease. And generally you do that with asking a few neutral questions first, just to kind of ease them into the interview before you start asking some of the more complicated questions. It also gives them a little bit of an idea of how the interview is going to work, and it gets them used to you as well, all of which will kind of just help them to settle into what's going on. And then finally, it's very important that you remind your interviewee of the ethical issues. So things like confidentiality, there'll be no names attached to whatever gets said. Everything is said in complete confidence. They can leave whenever they want if the questioning gets a little bit too hard, or if it gets too sensitive, then they can leave if they wish. So let's have a look at some of the pros and cons of interviews. So first off, strengths. Structured interviews are very, very straightforward to replicate. Everything is standardized, everyone gets the same questions, and that means that any interviewer can go in with a set of questions and repeat the interview. Okay, so that's a very good thing. Unstructured interviews are very, very flexible. Okay, so it allows the researcher to delve a little bit deeper into a question that might have been answered, or to kind of investigate a little bit more if there was something interesting that they want a little bit more detail in. That's something that a structured interview doesn't allow, but an unstructured interview encourages, which means that an unstructured interview can often get just that extra little bit of detail that a structured interview may miss. However, that being said, weaknesses. Structured interviews are very, very rigid. Okay, so interviewers can't deviate from the topic, which can be very, very frustrating, because sometimes an interviewer may want to ask a follow-up question because something interesting was said, but they're not allowed to. So like I said before, that means that they could miss out on a few little bits and pieces that could just clear up a few things. Also, unstructured interviews can be quite tricky to analyze, because there's so much information that comes in, and a lot of that information may not be relevant, particularly not if the interview's gone down a line of questioning that maybe wasn't as important, but it kind of happened anyway, being able to sift through all of that information and find the bits that are important can take a lot of time and can be quite difficult. And then finally, an issue with both types of interview is that, again, you have a social desirability bias. Okay, so people will lie to make themselves feel better or to make themselves look better in the eyes of the interviewer. Okay, so particularly when they're talking about sensitive topics. Okay, now it has to be said as well that a trained and good interviewer should be able to establish enough of a relationship with the person that they're interviewing to either be able to see through it or to put them at ease enough to make them not worry about how they're answering with certain topics. Okay, but social desirability bias is always going to be a little bit of an issue. Now, any self-report technique is only ever as good as the questions being asked, and very often the wrong questions can produce bad results. Okay, so there are a number of things that you have to be aware of when you are writing questions to an interview or writing questions for a questionnaire. Okay, so clarity is the most important thing. Okay, so you want clear questions so that you can get accurate responses. Okay, in order to get accurate responses, you need to avoid the following things. So number one, don't use too much technical jargon. Okay, so for example, do you agree that maternal deprivation inevitably leads to affectionless psychopathy? Anybody who is not an A-level psychologist or in some way versed in these technical terms are going to get confused with what you mean, which is going to impact their answer. Okay, so don't make it unnecessarily complex. Keep it simple so that everybody knows what you're talking about and so that their answers can be as clear as possible. Next, try to avoid emotive language and leading questions. As an example, boxing is a barbaric sport and any sane person would want it banned. Okay, so the words barbaric and sane are very emotive and they tell you something about what the author of the questions actually feels about this topic. Okay, so if the person who's being interviewed picks up on that, then it might have an effect on their answers. Equally, when did you last drive over the speed limit is a leading question and it implies that the person has at some point driven over the speed limit. Again, a leading question could impact the way that they answer, which then impacts the accuracy of the results. So in either of these things, the author's attitude becomes clear and the results are impacted, or the responses are impacted. And then as a final thing, try to avoid double-barreled questions and double negatives, again, because they just make the responses unclear. Okay, so for example, do you agree that Premier League players earn too much and should give 20% of their earnings to charity? There's two questions in one question. So somebody might agree with one of the questions and disagree with the other question, and that makes their answer unnecessarily complex, and it means that they might struggle to answer, particularly if it's a questionnaire. Another one is, I'm not unhappy in my job. Agree, disagree. The phrasing of the question is confusing, and that will reduce the accuracy of your questions, okay, because it's a double negative. So if you ever get asked in an exam, what is wrong with this question? Okay, so it's come up in the past where they give an example of a question that was used in a self-report study, and you need to work out what was wrong with it and how you could improve it. Very often it will be something like this: too much jargon, too much emotive language, double-barrel questions, and so on and so on. So just keep an eye out for it so that you know what could come up. Okay, and before we finish off, just a few little examples of exam questions that could come up or that have come up in the past. So there's five there for you. So most of them are fairly self-explanatory. You've got your simple short answer questions and your simple evaluation questions up the top there. Where it gets a little bit more tricky, you just have to be aware of it a little bit, is if you are asked to either outline something or evaluate something, but in relation to a scenario of some kind. Okay, so if it says a limitation of asking parents to rate their own children, you need to make sure you say something like social desirability bias because parents might not want to admit that their own children are badly behaved because it could reflect badly on themselves. Okay, so you can't keep it generic, you have to apply it to the thing that you're talking about. Okay, and then equally down the bottom, the last one, the application question, what you'll often find as well is that you have one type of data collection being used in whatever question is being asked you in the exam, and you have to point out what's bad about that initial form of data collection and say why an interview or a questionnaire would be better, or how an interview and a questionnaire could improve on what you've on what they've already done. Okay, so again, it's knowing the pros and cons of one and being able to compare it with the pros and cons of another and be able to form an answer or formulate an answer to kind of match what they want. Okay, now just to be clear as well, these questions aren't extensive and they're also not exhaustive. So there's 5 questions there that have come up at some point in the past. I'm sure that whatever exam board you're going to be using will think of other ways to test you and kind of other ways to get you to apply questions. So just be on the lookout for the things that I talked about in this video and try and kind of work out how they could come up and how they could be used. Okay, getting you to design your own study is a big one, and obviously outlining and evaluating any kind of self-report is also, you know, fairly standard questioning, but the application ones are always going to be a little bit tricky and they can catch you out if you're not careful. Okay, so if it's asking you to evaluate something for a particular study, then make sure you actually apply it to the study or apply it to the scenario in a way that is practical, in a way that is logical, and in a way that could actually be done. That's how you're going to get your marks. Okay. Right, and that is the end. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's all made sense. Thank you very much for listening.